Welcome to Midnight Clues.
With Clara Monroe and Elias Gray, we pull apart the stories the world can't stop whispering about. Imagine a seemingly perfect family vacation shattering into, well, a million pieces in the blink of an eye. That's the unsettling reality at the heart of our deep dive today. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann.
Yeah, it's a case that still haunts so many people. On the evening of May 3rd, 2007, in Praia da Luz, Portugal, 3-year-old Madeleine just vanished from her bed. Her parents were dining with friends nearby.
And that single horrifying fact launched this massive missing person case that, it just captivated the entire world, didn't it?
Absolutely. It triggered countless theories, huge investigations, and just this lingering sense of heartbreaking uncertainty. The information we've gathered, it really provides a detailed look at this enduring mystery.
We'll be looking at, the initial police responses, how suspicions shifted over time.
And the long, really winding road in the search for answers.
So we're not here today to just rehash every single headline or fan theory you've heard. Our mission really is to cut through some of that noise.
Exactly. We want to understand the core elements of this profoundly complex case.
The established timeline, the critical questions that, frankly, still remain unanswered.
And that persistent feeling, that vital pieces of this puzzle are just still missing.
We'll carefully examine the sequence of events, the doubts that have been cast along the way.
And the ongoing efforts to find a little girl who became this, well, global symbol of both hope and, sadly, unresolved questions.
What started as just a frantic search for a missing child, it soon became tangled in, conflicting timelines and these unsettling whispers.
Let's peel back those initial layers, shall we? Let's see how the evening of Madeleine's disappearance actually unfolded, paying close attention to the details that, right from the start, didn't quite seem to align.
Okay, so the setting. The McCann family, they're on holiday with a group of friends. They later became known as the Tapas 7.
Right, staying at the Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz.
And they had this routine, apparently. Put the kids to bed in their ground floor apartment.
Apartment 5A, specifically.
Right, 5A. And then they'd go dine at the resort's tapas bar nearby with members of the group sort of taking turns checking on the sleeping children.
Standard holiday stuff for many families, maybe.
Yeah.
Now, according to his statement, David Payne, he's a longtime friend of Jerry McCann and part of that Tapas 7 group.
Yes.
He said he briefly went to the McCann's apartment, 5A, around 6:30 p.m. Jerry was supposedly playing tennis at the time.
Okay, check in.
Payne stated he saw Madeleine asleep in her bed. Said she appeared calm. Pink pajamas, I think he mentioned.
But here's where things immediately get, murky, isn't it?
Right away.
Oh.
Because Jerry McCann distinctly recalled returning from his tennis game around that same time, 6:30 p.m.
Ah.
And he said he found only Kate and their other 2 children, the twins, in the apartment. No mention of Payne being there or having just left.
So that creates a direct conflict with Payne's recollection of his visit, a pretty significant one right at the start.
It does. And adding to this initial confusion, while Kate McCann also confirmed that David Payne had checked on them.
So she corroborated his visit.
She confirmed a visit, yes, but her memory of the exact duration of his visit and, the specifics of their interaction, it was less clear, more uncertain than Payne's quite detailed account.
That's interesting. What's particularly notable is that contrast you're saying. Payne offering this very specific image, Madeleine, the pajamas, her state of sleep.
All during what he described as a very brief check. Maybe 30 seconds, he estimated.
And this level of precise detail, it stands in stark opposition to the more general, less time-specific accounts from the other members of the group about their checks later that night.
Exactly. That difference in the specificity of their memories, it naturally prompted questions from the investigators later on. Was Payne's vivid recollection just, him being particularly observant?
Or did it perhaps indicate something more? Something else.
That was the question hanging in the air.
And these initial timeline inconsistencies, they really laid the groundwork for further unease and scrutiny, didn't they?
They certainly did.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, what other unsettling pieces of information would eventually emerge concerning David Payne's role, potentially casting a more ambiguous light on his involvement later on?
So let's shift to the legal side for a moment. Initially, right after she disappeared, suspicion did fall on her parents, Kate and Jerry McCann.
It did, almost immediately in some quarters. But it's really essential to state clearly they were later formally cleared by the Portuguese authorities. There was just no concrete evidence directly linking them to her vanishing.
That's a crucial point to keep front and center. But there was that significant period where they faced intense legal scrutiny. September 2007, right?
Yes, that's when the Portuguese police formally designated Kate and Jerry McCann as arguidos.
Which means?
This is a legal term, basically meaning official suspects in their daughter's disappearance. It gave the police broader powers in their inquiries regarding the McCanns.
A huge development in the investigation at the time.
Absolutely momentous. However, this status wasn't permanent. By July 2008, the arguido status for both Kate and Jerry McCann was lifted.
And didn't the Portuguese police actually apologize?
They did. They issued a formal apology to the McCann family for the way aspects of the investigation had been handled during that period of intense suspicion.
But it wasn't just the McCanns under that legal microscope, was it? There was Robert Murat.
That's right. Robert Murat, a British-Portuguese property consultant living very close to the Ocean Club Resort. He actually became the very first formal suspect, the first arguido in the case.
And how did suspicion fall on him? What was the connection?
Well, a couple of things. He volunteered early on to act as a translator, helping with communication between the family, the police, the media.
Okay, seems helpful.
On the surface, yes. But then there were reported sightings of him behaving in a manner described as suspicious in the immediate hours and days following Madeleine's disappearance. So his property was searched pretty thoroughly.
And what came of those searches?
Ultimately, nothing conclusive. Despite the searches and the initial suspicions, no solid evidence linking Murat to Madeleine's vanishing was found. His arguido status was also revoked in July 2008, same time as the McCanns.
And he later sued some newspapers, didn't he?
He did. Robert Murat pursued and received substantial libel settlements from a number of media outlets over their coverage, suggesting his involvement.
So if we look at the broader legal picture here, one of the most persistent challenges throughout this whole thing has been what?
The almost complete absence of definitive physical evidence. No smoking gun, despite all these extensive searches, forensic analyses over years and years. Nothing directly connects any specific individual to Madeleine's disappearance in an undeniable way.
Which brings us to the sniffer dogs. That's a really contentious point, isn't it?
Hugely contentious. British sniffer dogs, specifically trained to detect the scent of human cadavers and blood, they alerted inside the McCann's holiday apartment.
And in their rental car too, right? But there's a catch.
A big catch. These alerts happened several weeks after Madeleine had disappeared. And crucially, the car they alerted in wasn't rented by the McCanns until 3 weeks after she went missing.
So the timing is problematic for interpretation.
Extremely problematic. It raises significant questions about the reliability, the contamination possibilities, and just the overall interpretation of these alerts. Plus, the subsequent DNA analysis of the samples collected based on these dog alerts, mostly inconclusive, open to very different interpretations by forensic experts.
Did this dog evidence feed into any specific police theories at the time?
It certainly fueled one theory the Portuguese police explored for a while, the possibility of an accidental death inside the apartment.
An accident? Like how?
Well, speculation arose, possibly linked to sedatives. There was a later admission from Kate McCann's father about the family having Calpol, a children's pain reliever. The theory suggested maybe an accidental overdose, followed by the parent staging an abduction to cover it up.
That's a heavy accusation.
Extremely. But, and this is important, that line of inquiry was ultimately dropped. It wasn't supported by sufficient corroborating evidence. Despite the dog alerts and the sedative questions, there just wasn't enough proof to substantiate that specific theory of accidental death and cover-up.
Okay, so let's look at the main arguments or theories that have dominated this case. From the very beginning, the McCanns themselves have held firm to one explanation.
Right. Their primary unwavering argument has always been the abduction theory, that Madeleine was forcibly taken from her bed from that unlocked apartment while they dined nearby.
And this theory got a lot of traction initially.
Immense traction. It dominated the early news coverage, generated huge public sympathy and support, and there were potential witnesses.
The sightings.
Yes, most notably Jane Tanner, one of the Tappas Seven, and an Irish family, the Smiths. They reported seeing a man carrying a child, possibly matching Madeleine's description, on the night she disappeared, around the time she went missing.
But their sightings have been questioned, haven't they?
Heavily questioned. The reliability, the exact timing, the descriptions, the interpretation of who they saw and what they saw, all of it has been subject to considerable debate and scrutiny over the years.
So in stark contrast to the McCann's abduction theory, you had the Portuguese police, particularly the lead investigator early on, Gonçalo Amaral.
Yes, Amaral and elements within the Portuguese police increasingly came to suspect the McCanns themselves were involved. The inside job suspicion, as the media often called it.
They believed Madeleine had died, perhaps accidentally, and the parents orchestrated a cover-up.
That was the core of their suspicion, that the abduction story was fabricated to conceal the truth of her death.
And what fueled the suspicion? What were they basing it on?
Several key things we've touched on. Those timeline inconsistencies involving the Tapas 7 checks and Jerry's return from tennis. That was a big one.
Okay.
Then the sniffer dog alerts in the apartment and the rental car. For the police leaning this way, that was seen as potentially indicative of death.
Right, the controversial dog evidence.
Exactly. And finally, the Portuguese investigators cited what they perceived as unusual or perhaps inconsistent behavior from Kate and Jerry McCann in the immediate aftermath and the weeks following her disappearance. Their demeanor, their reactions.
Perception can be subjective, though, can it? Especially under that kind of stress.
Absolutely. And that's part of the ongoing debate.
Now, this brings us back to David Payne again. There was another disturbing piece of alleged information involving him, wasn't there? From years before.
Yes, a Dr. Catherine Gaspar. She provided a statement to the British police, Leicestershire police, actually.
About what?
She recounted a conversation she claimed she overheard between David Payne and Jerry McCann during a completely separate family holiday back in 2005. So 2 full years before Madeleine disappeared.
Okay, what did she claim she heard?
According to Dr. Gaspar's statement, she allegedly overheard Payne making what she described as inappropriate and unsettling comments about Madeleine and also about other young girls who were present on that earlier holiday.
That sounds quite disturbing.
It is undeniably disturbing if true. However, it's vital to put it in context. This account was based solely on Dr. Gaspar's memory from 2 years prior. There was no direct corroboration from anyone else present at the time.
And a McCann's reaction.
They publicly defended David Payne against these specific allegations.
Okay, another theory explored, particularly by the British police later on, was the idea of a burglary gone wrong.
Right. Operation Grange, the UK investigation, looked into this. The thinking was maybe burglars entered the apartment, Madeleine woke up or interrupted them, and they panicked and took her.
Was there a basis for this? Like, were burglaries common there?
There were some reports suggesting maybe an increase in local burglaries around Praia de Luz at that time, so it wasn't plucked out of thin air.
But did it fit the facts of this particular case?
That's where it gets tricky. The main issue, as we mentioned, is that apparently nothing of value was reported stolen from the McCann's apartment, just Madeleine.
Which isn't typical for a burglary, is it? Usually they take valuables.
Exactly. It makes the botched burglary theory a bit harder to square with the known facts, although not entirely impossible, perhaps.
Then years later, the whole investigation takes this huge, unexpected turn.
A massive turn. In 2020, German law enforcement authorities stepped forward.
And they name a suspect?
They identify Christian Bruckner, a German national, a convicted sex offender with a history of burglaries too. And crucially, he was known to have been living in and around Praia de Luz at the exact time Madeleine disappeared in 2007.
So he was there, and they named him as
a prime suspect, yes. They went further, publicly stating they had concrete evidence, their words suggesting Madeleine was likely deceased and that Bruckner was responsible.
Concrete evidence. That sounds significant. What was it? What did they reveal?
Well, they cited primarily 2 things publicly. First, records of Christian Bruckner's mobile phone activity on the night Madeleine disappeared. Apparently, it pinged off a cell tower very near the Ocean Club resort around the critical time window.
Okay, placing him nearby. What else?
They also referenced a cryptic statement Bruckner allegedly made to an acquaintance at some point, which supposedly implied involvement or knowledge. The exact details of that statement haven't been fully disclosed publicly.
But is that enough? Is there forensic evidence? DNA?
That's the crucial point. Despite the German authorities' confidence and their statements, to date, no conclusive forensic evidence, no DNA, no fibers, nothing definitive directly linking Christian Bruckner to Madeleine McCann or the apartment has been revealed publicly.
And Bruckner himself?
He has consistently maintained his complete innocence in the Madeleine McCann case through his lawyer.
So another suspect identified, strong statements from authorities, but still no definitive proof made public.
Precisely. It added a major new dimension but hasn't yet led to a final resolution.
Looking back over this incredibly long investigation, there seemed to be several key moments, real turning points that shifted everything.
Definitely. One of the earliest and maybe most impactful was back in August 2007, those sniffer dog alerts we discussed.
Right, the cadaver and blood dogs.
The fact they alerted in the McCann's apartment and rental car, regardless of the later interpretation issues, that dramatically shifted the focus of the Portuguese investigation onto the parents. That led directly to them being named arguidos.
And around that same time, June 2007, there was that Portuguese magazine article.
The Pact of Silence, yes. That article really amplified suspicions. It highlighted alleged inconsistencies in the Tapa Seven's accounts and openly questioned the McCann's narrative. It definitely fueled public doubt.
Then the removal of the lead investigator, Gonçalo Amaral, in October 2007. That must have been significant.
It was. Amaral had become very public with his accusations against the McCanns, and had even accused British police of bias towards them. His removal marked a change in the official Portuguese approach, though many believe suspicions lingered internally.
Fast forward a few years, 2011, what happened then?
That was the launch of Operation Grange by Scotland Yard in the UK. A huge reinvestigation.
A fresh look.
A very large-scale review, yes. It signaled a renewed commitment from the UK with significant resources, focusing largely back towards potential abduction scenarios, looking at new leads, re-examining old ones.
And then the most recent major turning point, 2020.
The identification of Christian Bruckner by the German prosecutors, announcing him as the prime suspect and stating their beliefs that Madeleine was dead. That provided a massive new focus after years where the case seemed to have gone cold publicly.
But here we are now. Despite the identification of Bruckner, despite the German authorities' stated confidence in their concrete evidence, several years have passed. No charges filed against him specifically for Madeleine's disappearance.
It leaves you wondering, doesn't it? What crucial piece of evidence are they still missing? Is it findable? Will that definitive link, if it exists, ever actually surface?
So considering everything, the years, the different investigations, the suspects named and cleared, the theories, what's the verdict? Where does this case stand now?
It's frustrating, but the honest answer is, regrettably, despite all the intensive efforts by Portuguese, British, German authorities, private investigators, Madeleine McCann's disappearance officially remains unsolved.
No definitive conclusion about what happened or where she is.
None whatsoever.
And it's really important, you feel, to reiterate the status of the McCanns.
Absolutely crucial. While they faced that intense suspicion, became arguidos, no concrete evidence ever definitively linked them to their daughter's disappearance. The Portuguese authorities lifted that status, apologized even. They remain, in the eyes of the law regarding this case, victims.
And Christian Bruckner, the current prime suspect.
German prosecutors maintain their strong belief in his guilt based on that circumstantial evidence of phone data, the alleged statement. But again, no direct forensic proof, nobody's ever been found. And critically, as of the latest public information, he has not been formally charged in the Madeleine McCann case. He's in prison for other serious crimes, but not for this.
So after all these years, all these resources, all this global attention, we are left with just profound unsettling.
Enduring uncertainty, that's the word. The case is technically still open in some places, but the hope of finding Madeleine alive realistically fades with every year that passes. The truth of what happened that night in Praia da Luz remains this deeply painful, stubbornly elusive mystery.
This a whole deep dive, looking at all the available information, it really seems to hammer home one big takeaway, doesn't it?
I think so. The Madeleine McCann case serves as such a stark, poignant reminder of how incredibly complex, how deeply frustrating missing person cases can become, especially when they explode under the glare of intense public and media scrutiny.
It really highlights the challenges, right? Trying to piece together fragments, dealing with conflicting witness statements.
Absolutely. And the dangers of speculation, of theories, sometimes overshadowing the slow, methodical search for actual factual evidence.
It really forces you to think about the bigger picture, the questions this case leaves us with.
Definitely. Profound questions about the limits of investigation, even with massive resources, the huge impact public opinion and media narratives can have on everything, the investigation, the people involved.
And that basic human need for hope, for resolution, even when the odds seem stacked against it.
Right. And it makes you ask, in this world we live in now, saturated with information, instant judgments, how do we square that need for answers with the reality that sometimes there's just no definitive proof?
And what responsibility do we all have as consumers of this information, maybe even participants in the discussion online, to ensure that the search for truth doesn't just become another source of pain for the people who are already living through an unimaginable tragedy?
It's a heavy thought. So what does this all ultimately mean? Having gone through all this information on Madeleine McCann's disappearance, We're left, honestly, with far more questions than answers.
It's a testament to just how enduring and perplexing this mystery really is. We've seen how assumptions can shift dramatically, how suspicion can be cast, then lifted.
And how even a relentless pursuit of truth, spanning multiple countries in nearly 2 decades, can still end up at this frustrating, painful impasse.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I think, for you, the listener. While official investigations might pop up again, the story of Madeleine McCann, it remains this touchstone. It keeps sparking discussions about media influence, about parental responsibility under horrific pressure, about the very nature of uncertainty itself.
It really compels us to think about how we process complex, emotionally charged information. How do we form opinions when we don't have all the facts? And maybe most importantly, how do we grapple with the unknown, with ambiguity?
Okay, let's try and distill this final thought for you, the learner. This case, with all its bewildering twists, its heartbreaking turns, it's just such a powerful, sobering reminder, isn't it? That sometimes, despite our deepest human need for closure, for clear answers,
Some puzzles might just remain stubbornly unsolved, maybe forever.
it challenges every one of us, I think, to embrace nuance, to resist that incredibly strong urge to jump to conclusions, especially when emotions run so high, as they do in this case.
The search for Madeleine, literally for her, but also metaphorically for the truth, it continues. In the hearts and minds of so many people worldwide, she remains this poignant symbol, a child lost, and the enduring, almost defiant hope for her return, or at the very, very least, for the full, unvarnished truth of what happened that night to finally emerge.
Thank you for taking this incredibly difficult but important deep dive with us.